Good morning, everybody. Pleased to see you back here. Welcome to the newly arrived. It's a pleasure to open our second day with a keynote speech by Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington, and I'll be introducing her. She's an associate professor of social psychology in the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Sciences. She's also a visiting researcher at the Department of Psychology of the University of Oslo, the Department of Political Science and Government at Aarhus, and a member of the LSE International Inequalities Institute, and also of the Community Engagement Center and the Indus Health Network. So very widely connected. She received her PhD in psychology from Harvard. Jennifer's work has investigated the ways in which social context affects psychological processes, with a particular focus on the psychology of social class. Her work also has an interdisciplinary character, drawing on insights from psychology, sociology, public health, and behavioral economics. Armed with these insights, she uses experimental methods to understand the association between lower socioeconomic status and suboptimal behaviors, such as unhealthy food choices or risky borrowing. Her ambitious research program has received funding from the NSF, Harvard's Kennedy School Multidisciplinary Program in Inequality and Social Policy, the Harvard Interfaculty Initiative on Mind, Brain and Behavior, the Tobin Project, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and the British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. She has published in journals such as the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Owing to her insights into psychology of social class, we believe that Jennifer is an excellent person to open the second day of our conference. We're very glad to have you here. This floor is yours, Jennifer.
Great, thank you so much. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and I've had a very keen look through the program, and although I haven't been able to stay for the 2 days, I was caught between teaching and childcare this week. I'm following people's names and work because there's so much really interesting work being presented, and I'll be here for the rest of the morning, and I'm really excited to hear about the results of the effort project. Jonas and I met each other virtually when he was presenting at the LSE, hosted by Lucinda Platt, and I was like, oh, this kind of research is very relevant to my kind of research. It's one of those moments where you realize you can be doing similar things in different disciplines, and we need to have an interdisciplinary conversation. So we started the conversation with my questioning then, and I'm looking forward to continuing it now with you giving me this space. Thank you. In the middle?
Yeah, not in the light.
Oh yeah, thank you. Great. Okay, so what I thought I would do today then is just give you an overview of my research program and how this kind of research from psychology speaks to some of the questions you've been thinking about over these days in terms of decision-making, cognition, effort, broadly defined, and low-income or socioeconomic inequalities. And as a psychologist, what typically comes to mind when you think of psychologists is you think of, oh yeah, okay, they're the ones that we turn to help people behave better in the face of adversity, to help people develop the right kind of mindsets. I mean, it's psychologists, for example, who have encouraged people when facing adversity, such as scaling an ominous mountain peak, to give of the importance of giving maximum effort, and a range of skills to do with applying mental concentration, what loosely might be referred to as executive functioning. I'll go into detail there. To keep your eyes on the prize, to stay focused on your goals and to behave in line with your goals, what we call self-regulation. To look on the bright side, to be positive, to be optimistic, maintenance of positive affect, and to lean on others, to see others as potential helpers to getting ahead or dealing with adversity, and importantly, to believing in yourself. You can do it. You have control over your environment. But of course, as I don't need to tell you, it's one thing to be facing a mountain peak like this, and quite another to be facing a mountain of food in a food bank, which you're going to because you do not have enough food put on the table for your children, which the experience of which, the social experience of which, is one of a sense perhaps of being outside of society or having failed in terms of society's expectations. So I just want us to think about, what role does psychology have, or do these mindsets play when we think about adversity of this kind? And how I got into this question, as Jonas mentioned, I did this interdisciplinary program at Harvard in Inequality and Social Policy. I was the first psychologist to do it, so I had a lot to say. But there I came across a lot of work around the behavioral dimension of poverty and low SES. This had previously, historically, been studied as a kind of culture of poverty literature, which was then kind of left behind in sociology because of its pejorative reasons, tones that it took. But in behavioral economics, there was this new paradigm for how we might understand decision-making in context of poverty using experimental methods that really excited me. The broader context of these questions is, whether we like it or not, there are these observations of behavioral disparities across the socioeconomic gradient. Whether that's in terms of those lower in income being more likely to make bad financial decisions and not to take out bank accounts, to take out high interest loans, performing worse in educational tasks, not focusing on education, investing in education, engaging in less exercise, eating more unhealthy food, and engaging in unhealthy, even costly behaviors such as excessive drinking and smoking. Now, of course, before we go anywhere in terms of the role of behavior, we need to think about environmental constraints. There are very many non-psychological reasons for why people might behave in so-called suboptimal ways in low-income contexts, which I won't go into today, but just for the most obvious ones, it is impossible to exercise if you live in a completely unwalkable environment. It is very hard to be able to afford healthy food, especially food that you can cook, especially when you have predatory targeting of advertising and of fast food outlets in low-income areas, and that's the same for cigarettes and for drinking and gambling, etc. But even in the context, if we set those aside, so goes the thinking, there's still an extent to which there are decisions and behaviors that people are choosing to do. I often try to use the example of smoking. Smoking is something that is actually costly, so you can't say that there is maybe a financial barrier to choosing to smoke. Surely there should, if there's a financial barrier, people should be choosing not to smoke. So surely this is the situation where conservative social critics, and certainly coming from the UK tabloid media, are the most likely to say, isn't this just people's fault? Isn't this a problem with their mindset, their psychological skills, their traits? Isn't this just down to the person? Because they're literally choosing to behave in a way that's harmful. And that's where my research approach comes in. It was being convinced that social psychology could play a role in helping address this question, especially building on this wave of using experimental approaches, as was pioneered by, at the time, Mullainathan and Shafir. So here's how I think about it. I try to think about decision-making in socio-ecological context. So how can we understand decisions as responsive to the environments in which people live? I take a socio-ecological perspective. It's just a broad umbrella term, but it does incorporate things like the material environment, but also the social environment in which people live. And I think material and social resources are very important for trying to understand how people can make decisions that help get them out of poverty. And those resources themselves aren't always abundant. They can be scarce. And even if they are sometimes abundant, if they're unpredictable, if you cannot predict how much of those resources you're going to get, either social cooperation or material resources, this is going to shape your decision-making context. And I think it shapes your decision-making context in quite adaptive and reasonable ways, especially if you consider that context. So what I'll do in this talk is I'll go through those 5 umbrella kind of areas of psychology that I talked about, the different mindsets, and then I'll consider the ways in which material and social adversity those situations, those contexts might shape these mindsets. And a running theme going through it is to think about the extent to which this shaping is necessarily a disruption. Is it necessarily harm? Is it necessarily bad cognitive functioning? Or is it cognitive psychological functioning that's rationally responsive to these socio-ecological cues? Okay, so effort. I've described executive functions here as giving maximum effort for the sake of this conference, but I remember this is what started our conversation is kind of what is the role of effort in executive functioning tasks, so I hope we can delve into that further. But I'm just, for those who are not familiar, when we talk about executive functioning in psychology, we're really talking about these, I guess, higher level cognitive functions that monitor and direct the rest of our cognitive functions. So this is not intelligence, this is not reasoning, this is that part of your brain that enables you to direct your attention towards a reasoning task in the first place. I'll focus on 4 of them. Inhibitory control is one. The ability to resist a prepotent response or a facilitated response for the sake of a target response. Here's the Stroop task. It's easy to answer. If I tell you to tell me the color of a word, it's easy to get the first one red, easy to get the second one blue, harder to get the third one. You want to say red, but it's actually blue, right? So the facilitated response is red because that's the word that's written, but the correct response is blue. And your ability to resist that impulse and to give the correct response is indexed as or measured as your inhibitory control skills. Another executive function is planning. This is often measured with the Tower of Hanoi task, the extent to which you can think ahead, or a game of chess, let's say, the extent to which you can think ahead about the implication of something you're going to do now for the future. In the Tower of Hanoi task, you have to try to arrive at a target array of disks across rods in as few moves as possible. So if you make a mistake with a move, you have to pay the price later. That's why it's about planning and thinking ahead. Working memory, so this is not long-term memory. This is not even, this is also known as short-term memory, although the distinction between them is a little bit subtle. But let's just think about it as the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in the front of one's mind. A classic measure of working memory is an updating task, such as the to-back task, where you have to, you'll see one letter, then you see a fixation cross, then you see another letter, fixation cross, then let's say you see a G again. That's the point where you need to press the spacebar to say, oh yeah, that was the same as the letter that appeared 2 letters previously. But you have to keep updating what's in your mind, because you don't know which letter is going to match the one that appeared 2 letters previously. So that's why it's about your ability to keep all of those things in your mind. And lastly, shifting, or cognitive flexibility, is the ability to switch between tasks with different goals. So in this task, which is a classic cognitive flexibility task, first you're asked to categorize things by shape, and then suddenly the rule changes and you have to categorize things by color. And so how well you do in the task is measured by the reaction time cost of that switching between the tasks, where higher reaction time is lower score. Okay, so I dwelled a little bit on executive function because I know it's going to be relevant later, but I will go more quickly through the other ones. So here's the classic work I was talking about. There were 2 papers that came out in Science, and I'm sure people are aware of them, where the authors demonstrated through experimental methods that perhaps that performance on such cognitive tasks seemed to be caused by experiences associated with financial strain, scarcity, or poverty. So one of the most striking demonstrations here shows that Indian sugarcane farmers, the same people, exhibit more errors in a cognitive control task, an inhibitory control task, pre-harvest, before they've been paid, and when they have greatest financial strain, than post-harvest, after they've been paid. And importantly, they also perform worse on the test of verbal reasoning, of intelligence, just showing that you will appear less intelligent if you don't have your executive functions online. These are the same people, so it can't be that they're actually less smart, and that's why they're poor. It's in the moments they're poor, they're performing worse on these cognitive tasks. Also in that Manny et al. Paper, they demonstrated, this is with samples in New Jersey shopping malls, that it's only in conditions where you get people to think about financial difficulty, which is the hard condition here, that you see performance differences on both of these tasks across the socioeconomic spectrum. If people don't have these financial concerns on their mind, there seem to be no performance differences. This is a particularly striking work. Its explanation of things is slightly different to my own, but I think it's really important to lay out there in terms of a principled demonstration that just material adversity, or in this case resource scarcity, seems to be impeding cognitive function as they talk about it. How I looked at this was part of a British Academy postdoc that I did at Brunel University. Here's my Brunel collaborators, Isabel Scott and Michael Price. What we did is we just say, well, first of all, is it really the case that all kinds of scarcity are the same, as is claimed by the book Scarcity? Or might we think about scarcity in specific resources really mattering? And also, is it necessarily cognitive disruption or impeding that might be going on? Or might it be that the brain is just shifting its cognitive resources towards what it needs to address, towards addressing the pressing needs? So a socio-ecological approach triggers that sensitivity to how might the brain be reacting to the context. So what we did is we focused on testing this with one specific kind of scarcity, which was food scarcity. We did a lab study where we had just over 200 participants come in. They had all fasted for 12 hours. Half of them were randomly assigned to eat breakfast. This is a calorie-controlled, super exciting breakfast. And then we presented them with a number of cognitive tasks. And it had already been found that if you're fasting to this level, you will perform worse on cognitive tasks. What hadn't been done was to see whether the cognitive tasks might themselves be relevant to the kind of resource that's under threat when you're facing food scarcity. Because if it's the case that your cognitive resources have not just switched off, but have been reallocated to focusing on meeting the pressing need, then surely we might not see these performance decrements if we create variations of the tasks that involve food stimuli. So this is what we did. The fasting was a bit between subjects manipulation, but the variation of stimuli in the tasks is within subjects manipulation. So each person completes a number of trials of these tasks. One of them was a short-term memory task. They had to remember 15 words. The words are randomly ordered and they're not color-coded, as I've done for you here. But the reason I've shown them like this is so that you can see we have 5 food words, 5 emotion words, and 5 neutral words, and they're all matched for length and frequency, so enabling us to compare food versus non-food words in a controlled way. The other thing we did was a visual search task. Here you have to, as quickly as you can, find a target stimulus with an array of distractor stimuli. So here the target stimulus is kebab, find the kebab, you'll find it. But then what we do is we have another version of this exact same array where what you have to find is a boot, like a boot that people wear. And so here, each food stimulus has a matching item of clothing stimulus that has the same level of visual complexity, the same level of familiarity, and appears in the same position in the array. But people do 64 trials of this, right? So they're not noticing the exact same arrays. But of those 64 trials, we have 32 with the food items in a particular position and 32 with the matching non-food item in a particular position. The other thing that varies with the arrays is the array size, which is how they do it in the visual science literature, between 16 item, 24 and 36, which will matter in the results, you'll see. So first of all, what happens with the food, with the short-term memory task? Here, what we find is that on the non-food items, true enough, people perform worse in remembering the non-food items, but this performance difference goes away when it comes to the food items. So those who were fasting were not necessarily kind of shutting down their short-term memory, they were focusing on remembering the food items, although not significantly better at the food items, but the interaction is significant. When it came to the array sizes, when it came to the visual search task, here it really depends on the array size, whether it's a 16 item, 24 or 36 item. But you can see overall, everybody's faster at finding food items, but the facilitation effect, how faster you are at finding food items versus clothing items, is stronger in the hunger condition, in the food scarcity condition. So those who are hungry are faster at finding a food item versus its matching clothing item in the 16 item array. So this is especially in that array, although it holds out, I think it's marginal overall across all the arrays. So what does this mean? That it moves us, I think, from thinking about material adversity harming or disrupting cognitive function to modulating it and shaping it and focusing it on addressing the resource need. The other way in which I looked at this, and this is actually harking back to my PhD work, is to think about social adversity and the social aspect of socioeconomic status. And how do we manipulate this? Experimentally, it's quite hard, but it turns out at the time, a lot of Americans didn't really know where they sit in American society. There's a lot of misperception about where people sit. And so I just collected a bunch of demographic information from people and gave them false feedback about where they sit in American society. So it's very, very kind of blatant. This is kind of very old, so you can tell it's my PhD. So you are here or you are higher up in the ladder. And of course, we pre-test this a number of times to check for things like credibility and adjust it depending on the country we do it in, because some of these studies are done in the UK as well. So this is effectively manipulating your subjective socioeconomic standing in relation to others. And here we found, this is an example in the two-back task. I think I haven't put all of them up, but we found this in the two-back task for sensitivity, in the Tower of Hanoi task for updating, and also in inhibitory control task for Stroop. All of those were in American samples. And always small effects, but quite robust. The lower you are in perceived subjective SES, the worse you perform in this task. So this, and then what I did in this paper is I designed a credit card decision-making task that uses these executive functions. So that you need to scroll up and down to pick which credit card offer is the best offer. You have to resist the ability to choose the one with the lowest interest rate. You have to keep all the details in mind as you scroll. So it kind of uses executive functioning. We also find that you're less likely to pick the correct credit card offer if you're in this low subjective SES condition. This is work I did with Jim Sedanius, who was my PhD advisor. Then with Michael Price, we did some variations of this at Brunel because, what's happening here? Oh no, I'm low in SES, I'm just going to shut down my brain. No, you've given me feedback that I think I'm doing worse than others in society. I'm focused on status threat. So the variation that we did at Brunel was to say, what if we present these tasks not as measures of executive functioning that taps prefrontal brain activity the way I introduced them earlier? What if we introduce these tasks as measures of executive functioning, which is predictive of later life gains in socioeconomic status? So I presented people with, I introduced another manipulation. So you have high-low subjective SES and another between subjects manipulation of the perceived relevance of the executive functioning task, where in the high relevance condition, you were told that one paragraph of text telling you that executive functioning is linked to later life gains and socioeconomic status, real data and citations about that, and then there's a matching text just talking about executive functioning as linked to prefrontal brain activity, how it's normally introduced. And so my hunch here was that what's going on when people under status threat are performing worse in cognitive functioning tasks is that the cognitive functioning task is the last thing on their mind when they're dealing with either material adversity or, in this case, status threat. Can we design tasks and frame them in ways that make them more relevant to what people are addressing? And so here it looks like we can. Again, these are small effects. We found this with the working memory updating. So this is with the two-back task in an online sample. In the low relevance condition in the UK sample this time, a marginal effect in the direction that I'd previously found. But once it's high relevance, that effect is going away. It's flipping in the opposite direction. So we replicated this then again, this time in the lab, using a specific test of concentration, and it comes out a little bit more clearly. And here, actually, you can see when the task is framed as addressing later life gains in SES, it actually seems that there's better performance among those under status threat. So again, kind of challenging this notion of cognitive deficit and thinking about how it might be rationally reallocating. I don't have a sense of time. Where is it? Is there a clock? 20 minutes. Okay. So I got another. Okay, yeah, I'll go for. Okay, I'm just wondering how quickly I need to go through these. Oh yeah, brilliant. Okay. So that was executive functioning. It's not so detailed going through all the other mechanisms. I just wanted to dwell a little bit more on that one. How about all of these others? Self-regulation is important because focusing on future goals as opposed to current needs is something really important for getting out of socioeconomic adversity. And yet there are many pressing current needs that people need to deal with in adversity. So how this had been classically studied was in terms of Walter Mischel's marshmallow task. He found that the children who were able to resist the first marshmallow and hold off to get the 2 marshmallows that they were promised were the ones who had better income later in life, better happiness, physical health, etc. It's self-regulation is an umbrella term used to refer to a lot of things that are also studied in behavioral economics in the form of intertemporal choice and future discounting, and present bias more generally, also seen as impulse control or time horizon. The real question, or the way I like to frame it, is in terms of, are you prioritizing, not do you have good or bad impulsivity or self-regulation, but are you prioritizing short-term goals or long-term goals? How might this be reactive to material and social adversity? So one thing that Julia Buzan, who's a third-year PhD student in my lab, does is moving away from some of these experimental primes, tries to understand these behaviors in a large data set. We use the Understanding Society data set in the UK. It's longitudinal, very detailed financial information. And she looks at present bias behaviors in terms of, again, smoking, a costly behavior that is clearly harmful for long-term life outcomes, but maybe performs some important short-term goals. What she finds here is that, and this is just correlational, although she also does it longitudinally. I'll go into the longitudinal in a moment. But first we find that, one finding of hers is that subjective financial situation, how much financial strain you feel you're under, is not just a product of income, it's a product of a whole lot of other things to do with material adversity. But importantly, for current purposes, the more subjective financial strain you report being under, the more likely you are to be a smoker. And if you are a smoker, the more subjective financial strain you report being under, the greater number of cigarettes you are smoking per day. So this is cross-sectional data. It does hold out over time, wave across wave across wave, holding out over time. We also ran random intercept cross-leg panel models to look at if there isn't enough changing in smoking. Where there was, it also predicted across those 2 waves. But yeah, again, kind of harder to identify those longitudinal effects. So that was material adversity. Social adversity and self-regulation, I just wanted to mention the study because if you haven't heard of it, it's really, really important if you're thinking about Walter Mischel's work by Kid, Palmieri, and Aslin, published in Cognition. What they did was they took kids, did the marshmallow study, but they introduced another variation, similar to how we'd introduced another variation. And they said, okay, before we do this marshmallow task, the experimenter makes them a promise that he will bring them extra coloring pencils. I can't remember the detail. And he either delivers on that promise, that's the reliable condition, or doesn't deliver on the promise, and the coloring pencils never come. Then you do the marshmallow task, right? So then when you do the marshmallow task, If the experimenter didn't bring the coloring pencils before, and they say, oh no, but hold on this marshmallow and I'll bring you a second one, nobody's waiting for the marshmallow. Barely anyone's waiting for the marshmallow anymore. Right? So impulsivity has kind of gone out the window, or sorry, self-regulation has gone out the window. Everybody appears impulsive. But once the experimenter has made clear that he will deliver on his promises, that he did bring the coloring pencils, then when he asked the children to wait for the second marshmallow, almost everybody is waiting. So the SES differences in perceived impulsivity are kind of wiped out by differences in manipulating the socio-ecological context, by giving people cues as to, am I in an environment where I can trust people? Am I in an environment where it's predictable how things will play out? And I think that's critical because, of course, it suggests that what was going on in socioeconomic differences in Walter Michel's work were actually differences in the socio-ecological context into which people are socialized. The cues they're reading about, well, is the world a reliable place? Is this a place where people do what they say and where things play out as predicted? Also from social psychology, we have a whole literature on the psychology of power that's relevant to looking at self-regulation. This is one paper looking at how what we do is we experimentally prime people to feel high or low in power. Those who feel low in power feel less connection with this future self and engage in more temporal discounting. That's relevant because what that implies is that the more you see yourself as at the bottom of a social hierarchy, which I think one does when one is low in SES, the more likely you are to disengage from the future self and focus on the present. So that was self-regulation. I look less at positive affect, look on the bright side, but it has, by Johannes Haushofer, who I've worked with in the past, been very convincingly shown to be linked with income. This is not news. The poorer you are, the more unhappy you are. And he shows this through experimental work too, that if you do unconditional cash transfers, you can increase people's happiness. Ivan Cano, who is my fourth year PhD student, looks at one specific emotion, which is shame, and the shame of poverty. And he has a whole research stream on that. And here, this is just some of the work where he's demonstrated in a longitudinal sample of data collected originally in COVID and then 2 years later, that if you think you're lower in subjective SES, you report more experienced shame on a daily basis and more shame about your socioeconomic condition. I'm going to talk about the mediators later, actually. Okay, so that's lower or worse affect. Of course, Ivan builds on a lot of the work of Robert Walker in terms of looking at the shame of poverty in cross-national contexts. There's a lot of moderators of this. It depends how much people are shamed by the context in which they live. Okay, our penultimate one is social trust. You know, why do you have to have such a bad attitude? Why do you need to be so aggressive in school? Like, why are you so angry all the time? Just be polite, you know, just treat people with respect. Just trust others and know how to leverage social relationships to be able to get ahead. This is easier said than done when the environment in which you've grown up involves social breakdown or involves being disrespected by every institution you've interacted with, et cetera, et cetera. It's often measured with this really unsatisfactory question. I'm not sure what you guys feel about it. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can be very careful in dealing with people? The reason I don't like it is because it's kind of unclear what people mean by people, right? So I like to, and this is also a distinction that Jess and I made in our work looking at poverty and decision making, distinguish between in-group trust, interpersonal trust, trust in maybe your family, members of your community, people on whom you depend, and out-group trust or impersonal trust, trust in just members of society at large, kind of general strangers. And the reason that's important is because the psychology of social class work had demonstrated that there was greater prosociality among those low in social class, like greater altruism. And the theorizing there is that that is because people are more dependent on others. But at the same time, in the education literature, you find that there's greater antisocial behavior, for example, and greater aggressivity reported among low-income youth. And so what context is that? That's an institutional context. That's against like high-power figures or people who are not the ones you're dependent on in your immediate context. So it really matters who the target is. Del Hey et al. Have a paper from 2001 looking at the radius of trust, where they're actually saying, well, what is it that people mean when they respond to this question? And so they regress responses to this question on items from the World Values Survey that actually do distinguish between in-group and out-group trust. And this is what Ivan built on in his analysis of the World Values Survey. First of all, Jan Jakimowicz had found that income predicts general social trust, but not trust in one's community. If you then compute this radius of trust measure, the way Del Hey et al. Did, Ivan found that it's very clear that both at the cross-national level and within countries, the lower you are in income, the more narrow your radius of trust is. So it suggests that it's not just lower trust, it's that you're more trusting of those close versus distant. So here it is with radius of trust, and then here's another way of looking at in-group trust bias. If you take this world value survey out of the distinguished, then you find that the higher you are in income, the lower you are in income, the more biased you are towards Julia, in Understanding Society, there are a number of items also that deal with the social context. The Buckner Neighbourhood Cohesion Score is one, and perhaps unsurprising, the lower you are in income, Julia finds the more likely you are to live in neighbourhoods where you report having less strong social cohesion. You can see how a lot of these items are dependent on social cohesion. You also are more likely to report living in neighbourhoods with greater levels of social breakdown. And we look at this work in terms of Daniel Nettles' work, which looks at the extent to which, when we're thinking about the environment in which we're living, we kind of read from the environment that this is an environment of material scarcity. This is an environment where people are, to use Nettles' words, living on the edge. And if people are living on the edge, then if people are living on the edge, then it's more likely that they are going to behave in risky ways, right? So what Nettles says is that if you're living in environments of deprivation, you realize you're living in environments of desperation, such that people will do desperate things, sometimes harmful things, exploitative things in order to survive. So that's one kind of extreme way of thinking about how we get a breakdown in social trust at the neighbourhood level conditioned on material scarcity. This is just an example of, again, from social psychology, of how social exclusion, this time brought about by the cyberball task, where you're playing a game and then you're passing the ball between each other and suddenly they stop passing to you, so kind of immediate ostracism. Then your behavior in the trust game is affected by this, so you're less likely to behave in trusting ways. Okay, so I've covered 4 of these mechanisms. Give maximum effort, keep your eyes on the prize, look on the bright side, lean on others, and then try to walk us through a literature from a range of fields in terms of thinking about scarcity and unpredictability in material and social resources as kind of complicating things, as shaping things in terms of getting down this pathway. The last one I want to talk through is important because for me, I think the last one, it really is kind of a mediator of the link between the socio-ecological context in which people live and their decisions and behaviors. And that is perceived control, lower response efficacy, this notion of belief in yourself. So, okay, what do we mean when we say, and we ask people to believe in themselves, that they really can do something? Perceived control, it can be broken down into self-efficacy, the way it's most widely studied, the notion that I can do the things I want to do. But a less studied one, but we think just as important, if not more important, is response efficacy, the extent to which you think your actions actually have an impact on your important life outcomes. Because if you don't think your actions actually affect your life outcomes, does it really matter that you're able to do those actions in the first place? Will you be willing to invest, to hold off on current rewards for the sake of future goals, to behave in these kind of optimal ways if your behavior doesn't have an impact on the environment? So when you look at measures of this, it's in the World Values Survey. Some people feel they have completely free choice and control over their lives. Others feel what they do has no real effect on what happens to them. You find that those lower in income are lower in perceived control. Interestingly, Ivan finds that this is moderated by the social assistance programs that are available to people. So when those at the bottom of society do have a strong social safety net, this relationship is attenuated. He's just writing up that work now. The way Jim and I did this back in my PhD was looking at, I designed a household budgeting game to try and experimentally manipulate material adversity. You have to try to balance your household budget round after round. You're either in the rich condition or in the poor condition. And when you ask people questions such as this trait, what's meant to be this trait measure of perceived control, which I think you're going to hear more about later from Jess, is questions such as what happens to me in the future mostly depends on me versus I have little control over the things that happen to me. I also asked a measure of health efficacy. Do you feel efficacious in behaving in healthy ways? What you find is that, oh, sorry, I haven't got the results of this one. Oops. What you find is that those in the poor budgeting condition, those who play this game for 3 rounds where they aren't able to balance their budget, completely fictitious game, when you then ask them how much control they have over their life outcomes, they say that they have less control over their life outcomes than those who play this game as rich participants. They also report feeling less powerful in the game, but what's interesting is that there's this kind of enduring powerless mindset. I mean, I don't think it endures for too long. I think it only endures for like 10 minutes after the study, but it's a proof of concept to demonstrate how these experiences, if you imagine if they're chronically experienced, might shape people's sense of that they control their environments. And then what we find is that lower control in the poor condition also mediates the link between being in the poor condition and reporting lower levels of health efficacy. This is actually looking at control again, but with this social feedback, social adversity. Another way in which I've done this is presenting income scales, which is a more subtle manipulation that of course gets smaller and slightly more unstable effects, where either most people have to fill out their income. So this income scale goes very high, so most people end up being in the low income category. You can have another version of it where it goes very low and academics get to be in the high income category. Which rarely happens, or you can get the control condition, the medium one. And I don't know if you've filled out income categories, if you've ever had a little look to see how high or low they go as an indicator of how much you're earning compared to others. And it does seem that people do kind of read from that. People did think they were lower in society if they were in the low income condition here. So here's just an example of some of the results from this kind of work. If you get the negative SES prime, you report a lower sense of control, but this isn't the case if you get any kind of negative feedback about yourself, so it's not just a case of bad news. If you get feedback that you're less extroverted, you don't have this. Another way I've tried to rule out alternative explanations is in terms of varying what the outcome measure is. So this is this measure. So you can see when it comes to rating yourself on traits that are more about dominance and competence and power and assertiveness, if you fill out the scale in the low SES condition that we see here, you're lower on that, the same in control and high. But this isn't the case with warmth agreeableness traits. So it's not that you're rating yourself as worse overall, you're particularly rating yourself as lower on traits that are relevant to control and power. Oops. So perceived control matters, I think, as a mediator because I think it's a key read of our socio-ecological environment. When we have these levels of adversity, we are first thinking, okay, what does this mean for the extent to which my behavior is going to matter for my life outcomes? And everything else follows from that. And true enough, when Julia does some mediation analyses looking at the understanding society, she finds it's not necessarily the case that this path between subjective financial situation and cigarettes per day is mediated by subjective strain, just your self-reported stress. It's sense of control over your life outcomes. A sense of control, as you'll remember from before, also mediates for Ivan the link between subjective SES and experienced shame. Sense of control also mediates the link between financial pressure and your perceived career prospects. This is a second paper of Julia's where we do a number of discrete choice experiments looking at when is it that graduates from high and low social class backgrounds will choose jobs that have immediate benefits such as salary versus long-term benefits such as career progression. We find that material adversity makes you more likely to go for the jobs that give the immediate benefits and to undervalue career progression. This is a separate measure from that study. I'm not presenting the discrete choice study because it's too complicated. So then we end up with something like this, which is not a theory, but just a framework for trying to understand decision-making in context of socioeconomic strain. I think perceived control is this key kind of the conscious perception that gives you an indicator of how people are reading their environment. Subjective financial strain, I think, is another example of those. But then what we have is this kind of specialization, modulation, or calibration of key psychological mechanisms in response to these experiences, whether it's affect. I mean, you're just rationally feeling worse about things. Why should you feel better about things if things are really bad? On the cognitive side, it's a little bit more subtle. I think there's different forms of specialization, whether you're tuning towards particular rewards, if you're going to get the reward of later life gains in SES, for example, for doing a task versus not. If you're tuning towards particular stimuli, if you think of the food stimuli in the hunger study, and also other work by Mittal and others involving Wilhelm Frankenhaus, and from a more kind of evolutionary developmental perspective, has actually looked at different executive functions and how different executive functions might be more strongly upregulated in environments of adversity. So whereas inhibitory control, it doesn't make sense if you grow up in an unstable environment to develop good inhibitory control, because things are always changing, so why should you keep giving up on immediate rewards for future gains? It does make sense to develop good cognitive flexibility, though, if you remember the cognitive flexibility task. And that's exactly what they find in that work, which I hadn't had time to include today, is that cognitive flexibility is actually more strong in those who grew up in unpredictable environments when you remind them of unpredictability in their current environment. So that's what I mean by process tuning there. I also think this might be underpinned by just more concrete information processing, and this is drawing on construal level theory in psychology, which is how I get to this idea of proximal focus. So construal level theory makes two main claims. One is that we can think about focusing our psychological resources on proximal versus distal spaces, and psychological distance has 4 different dimensions that are correlated. Spatial distance, focusing on here versus far away. Temporal distance, focusing on now versus later, what we've talked about today. Social distance, focusing on those socially close versus distant, which I also touched on today, and focusing on the actual and concrete versus the hypothetical. And goals and education and future jobs and career progression, all of these things are very hypothetical. And they're not as real as the pressing needs that people need to face here and now. The other big claim of construal level theory is that it's concrete information processing that's associated with this proximal focus. So this is something that Jess and I go into in a report that I'm going to show in a minute, in terms of thinking about the relevance of construal level theory to some of this. Inhibition orientation is just a general orientation to focus on threats and not to act, as opposed to focus on rewards and take more risks to go out and behave in line with one's goals. And so I think this is relevant to a whole range of different decisions and behaviors in different contexts, and that rather than focus on the decisions themselves and changing the decisions, we might think about the psychological mechanisms underpinning them and the functionality or rationality of how those psychological mechanisms have shifted in response to adversity. Okay, so I've argued today that mindsets associated with flourishing should be viewed in socio-ecological context, and shown some research suggesting that material and social adversity seem to predict lower perceived control, lower positive affect. Try to present this as perhaps a rational recalibration for the environments in which people are living. Data for how low objective and subjective SES predict selective executive functioning, selective goal prioritization, current versus future, and selective social trust. And these might be a kind of an adaptive modulation. So I think a socio-ecological perspective on decision-making in low-income contexts can help embed decision-making in the situations of adversity, showing the importance then of using psychologists and psychology not necessarily to intervene on the mindsets, but to understand how the mindsets are embedded in the context, and then to be able to demonstrate causally, mechanistically, why changing context matters, not just for ideological reasons. So if you want to know more about this work, Jessica Ray is going to present later. She and I did a big set of systematic reviews for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. It's 2017, so a little bit dated now, but we're updating them, that you can access. It presents a framework that draws on construal level theory a bit more. And this is a 2020 paper where I also summarized a range of research on this. And yeah, there's lots more kind of ongoing. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you. Or you can take this, no, because I'm sitting now. Okay, all right. I'm done.
Thank you. This was very inspiring. So you showed there is a link between, and the literature between economic hardship and then after that people feel bad, stressed, depressed, shame, and then after that we see that people probably as coping strategies, they start doing different things, smoking, unhealthy food, or in my research they change their values or their political values or whatever. So I think the missing link here is how effective are these strategies for people to feel better. So this is always, you have shown that there is good research, and your research on the first link between economic hardship, some psychological bads, and then some behavioral change. But then do we know anything about whether these strategies are effective, at least in the short term, I guess?
Thanks, great question. It's not something I study directly, except that Ivan's third PhD paper is leaning in that direction. He's particularly interested in fatalism as a kind of philosophical present bias, as something that helps people deal with the affective harshness of poverty. And so he does have evidence, for example, that among those low in SES, if you also have a fatalistic worldview, you feel less shame. So it performs important kind of emotional goals for people, even if it's leading to focus on the present maybe is harmful in the long run. I think, and Jess and I discussed in the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report as well, the notion of proximal functions served by behavior versus distal. So I think that kind of is an avenue for how to think about it, without necessarily studying it directly. But I think it's a really good question as to is decision making that we say is optimal necessarily optimal? And another stream of my research actually takes these 5 mindsets, or kind of different variations of these mindsets, and sees what happens when we take them to the extreme, actually. What happens when we think about obsessive focus on goals, obsessive focus on productivity, and thinking about measuring the costs and benefits of everything you do. Thinking about social interactions as always instrumentalized and about helping you get ahead, being overly focused on having positive attitude at all time. With Sabrina Paiwand and also Denise Barron, also in my lab, we look at this in terms of what we call the marketized self. So we actually have like a personality measure that we've developed, which is effectively an internalization of neoliberal subjectivity. So all of these things that we expect of people, you know, feel positive, be self-regulated, focus on the future. If you take them to the extreme, it's kind of, that is the ideal neoliberal subject. And does that make people happy? Well, it's associated with happiness currently because it's that positive mindset. But we're looking at this over time to see if it actually might lead to anxiety. It certainly leads to negative social consequences. People are more politically disengaged. They feel more shame if they're low in SES. They're more disidentified with their social class if they're low in SES. This is all preliminary data. But lastly, it also is associated with things like narcissism, Machiavellianism, and social media addiction. So there's all sorts of problematic aspects of the way we want people to behave too.
Excellent. Jaime, then Heike. And
yes, well, thank you very much. And I was wondering about something which is the long-lasting effects of having experienced scarcity, and concretely having experienced it as a child. Are there long-lasting effects on adults' behavior once they are not experiencing scarcity anymore?
Yeah, great question, because lots of things we need to think about. Chronic exposure, and then exposure in critical windows, critical developmental windows. So I don't study either of these, but there is a great literature looking at it. Obviously, developmental psychology has looked at early childhood exposure, usually to more extreme adversity, and looked at mostly damaging cognitive effects. But the literature I really like, and I mentioned Willem Frankenhuis, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, Frankenhuis. Also Daniel Nettle, whose work I mentioned. They talk about a hidden talents, where they talk about growing up in harsh or unpredictable environments can lead to the downregulation of some cognitive social skills, but maybe the upregulation of others. And the theoretical perspective they work within is called life history theory. And in life history theory, which comes from behavioral ecology, a different field of biology, what's going on there is the thinking that we read from during childhood and even very early childhood, we get reads about how harsh and unpredictable our environment is. And we kind of like rationally develop strategies for directing the limited energies that we have in life towards kind of also fast life history strategies like rapid reproduction versus slower life history strategies. So there's kind of like a bigger area there. But the key point of that work is A, there are critical windows in childhood, and B, when you remind people of those childhood experiences, these differences really come out. And then C, these differences aren't necessarily all negative, sometimes they're positive. So definitely check out that work.
Heike, then next to Jaime.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. When I listened to you, I was always thinking, so if I would be a politician, right, what would I do? And so listen to you, I would say, for example, policies in against child poverty might be more effective than sending the children to psychologists, etc. So my question is, would you also draw this conclusion? And if it would be so, that relates to Louis' question. The second question, I mean, you showed different countries. But if your theory and your findings are correct, you should find country differences and social disparities, for example, in self-efficacy and all your functioning, right? You have more equal countries where you should find low. Have you looked at it across countries?
Okay. So what should policymakers do and how does this play across the world? Easy. I'm not a social policy expert, and I always get a little bit shaky when thinking about policy interventions, just because there are people who spend their entire full-time research focusing on the impact of different policies. But I do think that I do passionately believe that there is an important role for this kind of research in thinking about, in an empirical way, about the impact of different policy agendas on kind of the decision-making environment in which people live. One way of framing a response to what you said is in terms of, yes, if you address childhood poverty, you'll not just improve well-being and reduce suffering, you'll also improve decision-making. So there'll be this kind of double benefit. The second, the most obvious one is to just push back on discourse that puts negative behaviours down to exploitation of the welfare net or down to laziness and lack of intelligence. But beyond that, then I think you can get evidentiary support for different policies. I also think that something like universal basic income is a really interesting example. I'd love to hear the experiences of it in Spain, actually. But because the universal aspect of it addresses social adversity, because it's not that when you access this policy, you're reminded that you need it more than others. You access it because everybody accesses it. It's basic, so it addresses material adversity. It gives you what you need. And it's an income, so it addresses unpredictability, because you know that it's going to be coming every month. So I think that this lens can be helpful for understanding why we might see the positive impacts that we seem to be seeing with policies such as universal basic income. Cross-cultural one, Armin Falk, F-A-L-K, he's done some work with the Gallup World Poll looking at risk-taking and also present orientation across countries, because he has this detailed individual level data from Gallup and can combine that with the cross-national data. So I think that's probably the best data out there. It's hard to get the Gallup data at the individual level, so we can't look at it with these cognitive skills necessarily. We can look at it with things like sense of control, and that is where, within rich countries, sense of control, we're kind of doing the work where we're looking at how it plays out differently across the socioeconomic spectrum depending on the social safety net. Sometimes also depending on the wider socio-cultural context. Are there beliefs about meritocracy? Is it individualistic, etc.? But I also think that we need to be, if we go beyond rich countries and beyond Western countries, we need to be very, very careful about the constructs that we're using and the way we're thinking about notions of self-regulation, notions of control. And this is a point that Jess has made in looking at control as a construct that travels across contexts in these ways. But I also do work with Manisha Dhingra, who's just starting her PhD at Stanford, which is looking at the extent to which we can think of agency. It's drawing on Hazel Marcus's work. We can think like agency and control are seen as disjoint, very about me in Western contexts, but in non-Western contexts, often it's seen as conjoint. I see agency and control as what I can do with others. And self-regulation, Manisha, I think, might not just be about what I do on the temporal domain now versus the future. It could be regulation in a more relational domain. So I think we need to be careful in thinking about the fitness for purpose of the measures and the actual constructs when we go across culture. Sorry.
Okay, just a few minutes left.
I just want to, well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. This was great. And actually, my question was quite related to the first of Hika. But I wanted to ask your thoughts on whether there is a space or if there is a role for psychological interventions on this, especially thinking on the socioeconomic effects and decision-making effects that it, just like a psychological intervention could have on this.
Yeah, I do think that there's still some really important mindset or psychological interventions that are relevant. So obviously the thrust of my talk is to push back against this, but it still is going to be really important and helpful, because at the end of the day, people are living in middle-class worlds where they are expected to invest in the future. They are expected to behave in particular ways. So how can you help people to, condition their decision-making processes to work within one environment, even if they've been kind of socialized into another environment? But I do think that it should encourage us to think not just at the individual at the point of intervention, because what we learn here, it would be great to change society and do universal basic income, great, but there's a lot in between changing society and getting individuals to change, which is things like changing the nature of academic tasks to make them more relevant to the kind of things people are dealing with outside of the classroom, affecting neighborhood social cohesion, affecting the shaming of the poor, like stereotypes and discourse around poverty. There's a lot of meso-level interventions that I think capture still some of the social psychological flavor.
Jasper.
Yeah, thanks for showing such a wide range of findings. My question revolves around the relative importance of subjective socioeconomic status and socioeconomic status. So my assumption would be that subjective socioeconomic status is actually more predictive of later life outcomes than socioeconomic status.
More or not?
More.
Okay.
I believe it would be more predictive of later life outcomes. So what is your research?
I'd love to know why.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
I'd love to know, why do you think that?
I believe that, well, I mean, I have some evidence in my own research showing that it is driving how we behave and who we think we are. So it touches upon our self-concept, and in as much as our self-concept is a power that is leading us to a given goal or giving us a certain direction, it can be just powerful. And I think, I mean, predictability and unpredictability in adolescence, for instance, basically everything is unpredictable for everyone. So I don't know whether that is really specific to those who are low in income. And so I'm just thinking about some other social psychological concepts that could be even more important in determining later outcomes.
It's interesting what you said about times when everything's unpredictable for everyone. One thing Ivan and I looked at was the COVID pandemic, and we did an experimental prime just to get people to write about ways in which COVID, right in the middle of the pandemic, in the autumn of 2020, made their lives unpredictable or unstable. And there we find that the levels of control of those middle and high income go down to the levels of those low income. So those low income are always low in control, and they were also more present biased. But the fact that everybody else went down to that level implies that we're kind of temporarily experiencing what other people are experiencing all the time. The sense that you can't control what you're going to be doing in a few months, and you just don't know what's going to happen. But to address your question about the subjective, I do think it matters. I mean, obviously, I manipulate it and find that it has effects. But of course, I make it super salient to participants. So that's not really answering the question of whether in people's daily lives it is as salient to people. But there is a whole load of literature in social psychology on social comparison effects, relative deprivation, relative income. And I do think that, like Mitch Callan's work and even Paul Piff's work demonstrates the importance of perceived positioning in society. But the most robust evidence that I've seen recently actually uses a twin study design. It was published in PNAS, and I can't remember which research group it was, because I do behavioral genetics work, so I usually know the twin registries, but I don't know which twin registry this was. But they used a twin registry to do a co-twin design where each twin is a control of the other twin, which means you can control for all shared genetics if they're identical twins. And then they find that subjective socioeconomic status in adolescence predicts mental health later in life, controlling for everything else. So controlling for everything else the family's been to, where the only difference between these two twins is just where one of them thinks they are. And I think that's really kind of powerful evidence in favor of what you're saying. The self-concept really matters. Daphne Oysterman's work on the self-concept and the discrepancy between the actual and the ideal self is really important here too.
Thanks a lot. Sergio, just lightning question, please, and lightning answer, because we're running into the coffee break.
Yes. Well, actually, this segues into the conversation you guys were having. So, one way in which I tend to think about poverty is actually uncertainty, right? So, this delves into this question, this dialogue you were having, and so I may be outdated, but there are findings that say that more uncertainty triggers more deliberative cognitive processes, rather than online, so less automatic and more sort of deliberative, and that sort of should foster perhaps more cognitive effort. So I was just thinking about how this sort of finding sort of relates to your findings, and whether actually we should think about sort of differently on whether poverty is on, like, the degree of uncertainty within poverty. You know, there are certain poverty conditions, perhaps, you know, in rural communities where, you know, there is poverty, but the uncertainty is certain, right? Whereas, for example, urban poverty might have like a level 2 degree of uncertainty. So I'm just very curious to say what you think about it.
I'm very interested in that. Lots we could say maybe in the coffee break, but I will say the Willem Frankenhaus's lab, they use modeling and computational theory to predict the precise aspects of unpredictability. So when we say unpredictability, what do we need? We need resource unpredictability, temporal, spatial, and it really maps out, and what would be the impact of that on impulsivity. So Jesse Fenneman, who's one of his recently graduated PhD students, has a brilliant PhD just looking at the impact of modeling and the impact of that of modeling uncertainty and what that means for decision making. I think that that's the most promising avenue for trying to explore those questions. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you for a very stimulating opening keynote.